The wind had already passed when I saw it, an uprooted oak clawing at the air, its roots torn up like a giant's ribcage. In the dark soil, beneath something pale pressed through the earth, the way winter shows itself before the first frost, quiet, undeniable, and colder than anything the mountains had ever given me. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I keep a steady life. That matters especially in a place where days can blur into each other until you think the mountains themselves are breathing for you. I live in a small 2-bedroom ranch on the edge of Waynesville, a town that measures distance by church steeples and how long it takes to find parking on Main Street after Sunday service. Mornings in September arrive crisp and clean here. By 7, there's a shimmer of mist along the Pigeon River, and a low hum of tires on asphalt as folks head toward Asheville or the mills. I'm at the high school by 7:30, coffee in a stainless steel mug that stays warm until second period. Children carry everything on their shoulders these days. Books, phones, burdens. They don't have words for, so I listen. It's what I do best. Back then, early fall meant the first cold edge to the air, maybe 55 degrees F in the morning, climbing toward the low 70s in the afternoon. The trees were just starting to trade their greens for russet and gold, a slow drift you could see if you stood still long enough. The Bennett house was 10 minutes from mine, a pale blue split level with a porch swing that creaked in a way I always meant to fix for them. John kept the yard tight edges clean, mower lines straight as graph paper. He wasn't fussy, just careful. Eileen teased him about it and then spent her Saturdays doing the same thing with her book stacks on the coffee table, neat as shoe boxes, a bookmark here, a sticky note there. Abby moved through that house like a hummingbird. 10 years old and quick with a grin that ran all the way to her eyes, she collected rocks in a clear jar she kept on the kitchen counter, each one labeled in her crooked printing. River smooth, sparkly flecks, red stripe. She'd hold one up for me when I came by and tell me it looked like a dragon egg, and I'd nod as if I could see it too. I almost always could. On Fridays, if I didn't have ball game duty, I'd swing by after school. Eileen would be at the stove, turning a wooden spoon in spaghetti sauce radio low, her hair pulled back with a looped elastic she kept on her wrist. She had soft hands, lotion-scented and capable. "You hungry?" she'd ask, knowing the answer. John would come in at 6, long-step shirt-tucked tie loosened as he crossed the threshold. He'd kiss Eileen in that ordinary, rooted way married people do when they're not performing for anyone. He'd scoop Abby up and she'd pretend she'd grown too old for it, then fold into his shoulder anyway. The house held that kind of quiet comfort that never photographs as well as it feels. They were the kind of family that planned. Nothing fancy. No cross-country trips or fancy hotels, but they had a cork board in the hallway with index cards pinned under months. Groceries, immunization appointments. Abby's school play a weekend day hike for September because the weather was turning and the trails were about to be at their best. John had a topo map rolled in a rubber band with a pencil tucked inside. Eileen had a charger cable and a battery pack in a canvas tote with a camp mug rattling at the bottom. They weren't daredevils. They were careful, and that made me rest easier at night. The week before they set out, I walked with Eileen after dinner the street lit orange by a sunset that had the good manners to arrive on time. We talked about nothing big. Her latest mystery novel, the library's new fall display, the middle schoolers who'd turned the nonfiction shelves into a treasure hunt for jokes they thought adults wouldn't notice. She had that light in her voice that comes from simple, manageable plans. A lunch packed with peanut butter sandwiches, a trail along Big Creek because the water made the miles go faster. A campsite, she said John had read about with a good flat patch for the tent. Back Saturday night, if we're making good time, she said. Sunday at the latest. We stopped by the Bennett mailbox on the way back, and she flicked her eyes down to a credit card offer, shrugged, and laughed. The smallest moments are the ones that echo. I didn't know that yet. Saturday broke clean and blue. I was up early anyway, habit more than necessity, and I sent a quick message asking Eileen to bring me back a river rock if she saw one that reminded her of a dragon egg. She answered with a little heart and a promise. Then I went about the kind of chores you can finish before noon if you don't get sentimental about them sheets in the wash yard clippings, bagged a grocery run where I waved to two parents of seniors who still called me Ms. Whitman as if we were trapped in the same week forever. By 11, the day warmed into the 70s, and by noon, any breeze there had been lay down flat. I set my porch plants in the shade and let the cicadas take over. In towns like ours, everybody sees the same day, even if they're living different lives inside it. Mrs. Green at the diner leaned on the pass, hollered for hash browns, and later told me she could smell the storm that hadn't arrived yet. The park down the road at Lake Junaluska filled with the sound of aluminum bats and snack bar doors banging shut. Two of my students waved to me in the checkout line. One had a new Letterman jacket that he pretended not to notice was already too warm for the weather. That afternoon, I opened the jar of coins I keep for Abby and counted what she'd saved for a new pair of hiking socks. She thought tall socks were the secret to going an extra mile, and I'd told her I suspected she was right. The light in my kitchen turned a deep yellow around 4, a color my mother used to call supper light. I boiled chicken for the week and turned the radio low. It was that kind of day. At 5:12, my phone chimed with a single text from Eileen by the river, all good. I heard the sound and smiled without breaking stride, ladle in one hand, oven door in the other. That was Eileen short and to the point. She was as careful with words as she was with leftovers, saving exactly what she needed. I answered with a thumbs up and a little prompt, "Find me a dragon egg." No reply, which didn't mean much. Service up on Big Creek can be a patchwork of luck, and I'd learned not to stare at the phone when there's nothing to be done. I put the chicken in Tupperware and set the thermostat down 2 degrees. Evenings in September have their own rhythm. Conversations slide toward the quiet traffic thins and the porch light takes on work. It won't give up until morning. I changed the porch bulb that night, one of those small chores that makes you feel prepared for the wrong things. When the sun fell, it did it gently slow as a breath. I stood out back, listening to the night take shape, a dog 3 houses over a train horn from the east, then just wine slipping through the red maples I'd planted the year I turned 40. Sunday brought church, and then the Costco lot where you circle like a hawk until a space opens up near the door. I bought too many blueberries and justified it by telling myself I'd freeze half. On the drive home, the sky showed a small smear of cloud over the high ridge, but held its blue otherwise. The mountains weren't brooding, not yet. I put a roast in the crock pot, tore off a sheet of foil, and noted we were low. I'd replace it tomorrow. I don't keep a rigid schedule, but supper is supper, and that night I set a place for myself and a smaller plate for Abby because she always dropped by after a hike to tell me the best part and the worst part equal weights. And then she'd ask for ice water with exactly 3 cubes, because 3 was lucky. I filled the tray, slid it in the freezer, and set a towel on the counter so the glasses wouldn't sweat rings onto the wood. The house smelled like rosemary and onion, something warm and honest. The radio gave me the weather, not more than a minute of it, because in the mountains you still look out the window to know what you'll find. I checked my phone around 6 and again at 7. With the mountains, you learn not to count on their schedule or yours. The trails ask her own questions and sometimes answer late. Still, I sent a light message. "Got your egg yet? I'll trade you for dessert." I imagined the 3 of them laughing at a campsite table, the glow of a small stove. Abby's headlamp bobbing like a firefly. I pictured John pinning the corner of a map with his water bottle, tracing a circle with his finger, showing Abby how contour lines tell stories if you let them. I pictured Eileen tugging a blanket over her legs, the kind of small shiver she got just as the day tipped over and the air cooled. By 8, the cicadas had quieted and the crickets took up their work. I switched the porch light on just in case. Cars hissed past now and then, their headlights flickering through the curtained front windows. The roast clicked from simmer to warm without asking me. I played it a little and ate slowly, fork set down between bites the way my grandmother taught us. The ice tray cracked in the freezer and made me jump, then made me laugh at myself. 9 o'clock came, measured one show, ending another beginning. I washed my plate and set it in the rack. I sent one last message and watched the screen fade to black in my palm. It didn't bother me yet. The mountains can hold you up or hold you back, and both feel the same from a distance. I topped off the dog's water bowls and folded the dish towel in halves, then quarters, then halves again the way my mother did, because there's comfort in corners lining up. The house felt taller around 10. The kind of quiet that falls when you've run out of reasons to move. I walked to the door and eased it open a few inches, letting the cooler air into the hallway. Somewhere far off, a truck downshifted. A moth found the porch light and traced small, hopeful circles. I listened for tires on gravel, for a car door closing, for Abby's quick feet up my steps, 3 at a time. Always 3. On the table by the door, I set a glass and 3 ice cubes that chimed against each other as they settled. Then I sat. And I waited for the sound that should have come: headlights brushing the living room wall, a key in the lock, Eileen calling my name soft so she wouldn't wake the neighbors. The night held itself very still, the way a room does when it's expecting company. And somewhere between 10 and 11, the porch light began to look too bright for the hour, as if it were telling me something I wasn't ready to hear. The porch light stayed on through the night. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. When I woke the next morning and saw that soft orange glow still cutting through the gray, it gave me a small, foolish sense of comfort, like they'd see it from the road when they finally came back. But by mid-morning, when I hadn't heard from Eileen, that comfort began to shrink into something smaller, tighter. I made coffee, turned on the local weather, and waited for my phone to buzz. It didn't. At first, I told myself all the reasonable things. Maybe they decided to camp an extra night. Maybe they lost cell service. You can get lost in those mountains without even being lost. Sometimes it's just the signal that disappears, not the people. But when noon rolled past and I couldn't shake the feeling pressing on my ribs, I called John's office. His assistant's voice sounded puzzled when she said he hadn't come in. I thanked her, hung up, and immediately called the elementary school. Abby wasn't there either. That's when the quiet stopped being peaceful. I called the ranger station at Big Creek, my voice too calm, the way it gets when your body already knows what your mind won't accept. The man on the other end was professional kind. He asked for their names, the make of their car, their last known location. Then he asked me to hold while he checked. I could hear faint chatter in the background, radios, papers being shuffled. When he came back, his voice had changed just slightly. He said their silver SUV was still parked at the trailhead exactly where it should be if they were still in the woods. That single fact, something so small, hit me harder than anything else could have, because it meant they hadn't come out. I drove straight there. The mountains rose ahead of me like they always do, steady, indifferent, beautiful in that cool September light. But they looked different that day. There's a kind of stillness. Those woods have a hum beneath the quiet, and for the first time in my life, it felt like they were keeping a secret. By the time I pulled into the lot, there were already 2 ranger trucks and a few volunteers gathering maps and radio packs. One of them walked me through what they knew so far, which wasn't much. The SUV was locked undisturbed. No sign of forced entry. 2 half-empty water bottles sat in the cup holder. It looked like a family that had gone for a short hike and would be back any minute. But the clock said they should have been home the night before. Within hours, the search began. I watched as men and women in uniform spread out along the trail with dogs pulling against their leads, their collars jingling in the cool air. I followed as far as they'd let me, just to the edge of the woods, then stopped where the gravel met the dirt. I could hear the faint echo of my name being used in clipped radio tones, see the reflective stripes of jackets flickering through the trees. The Big Creek Trail runs alongside the water for a good stretch before climbing up toward the ridges. The air there always smells of wet stone and pine, that clean, sharp scent that usually clears your head. But that day, it just made everything feel sharper. As hours passed, people arrived from neighboring towns. volunteers who knew those woods better than anyone. They carried maps rolled up in back pockets, extra flashlights, bottles of water. Some of them I recognized from church or the grocery store. They nodded when they saw me, but didn't say much. Nobody wanted to give shape to what we were all thinking. I stood by the ranger truck while the search dogs circled and barked. Then, just like that, they went quiet. The handlers looked at each other, murmured something I couldn't hear, and one of them shook his head. The dogs had followed the trail for about 2 miles, and then nothing. They'd lost it near the riverbank, the spot where the water bends around a flat stretch of boulders. It was as if the world just stopped holding footprints there. By evening, helicopters came in low over the trees, the rotors chopping the air into heavy beats that rolled across the valley. I watched them from the parking lot lights, sweeping across the canopy like a searching heartbeat. They didn't find anything that night. When darkness fell, the woods went quiet again, and the sound of the creek carried farther than it should have. One of the rangers approached me gently and told me to go home for the night, that they'd start again at first light. I nodded, but I didn't leave for a long time. I stood there with my arms wrapped around myself, staring into the tree line, waiting for something, anything to move. The next morning brought the kind of dawn that feels too bright. Dozens of people gathered again, some with their own dogs, others carrying ropes and packs. The search widened north toward the ridges south along the tributaries. They checked the campsite the Bennetts were supposed to use, number 37, about 5 miles in. I waited near the radio tent when the call came through, no sign of occupation. The words felt clinical, like a label, but I knew what it meant. No tent impressions in the grass, no remains of a fire. Nothing to suggest they'd ever made it that far. Days folded into each other. I stopped noticing the difference between morning and afternoon. They searched for signs of a fall, a wrong turn, anything that could explain a family simply vanishing. Each evening, they'd return, exhausted faces streaked with sweat and dirt, and shake their heads. I learned to read the silence between their words better than the words themselves. By the 5th day, news cameras started to show up, and reporters asked me things I couldn't answer. Were they experienced hikers? Did they argue before the trip? Questions that felt like accusations wrapped in concern. I wanted to scream that they were good people, careful people, the kind who triple-check a map before they fold it away. But all I managed was a tired. They knew what they were doing. At home, the smell of their house clung to my clothes. Soap coffee, the faint sweetness of Abby's shampoo. I walked through their living room one evening with a deputy who needed to check for notes or signs of planning. Everything was as it should be. The calendar still had dinner plans for the next week. Milk in the fridge, a school form on the counter waiting for a signature. Nothing about it looked like an escape. It looked like a pause, like a life mid-sentence. Weeks passed and hope started to change shape. It became something thinner, quieter. I organized small volunteer searches on weekends with friends and locals. We'd drive out with sandwiches, maps, and a kind of determination that felt both noble and naive. Sometimes we found shoe prints, sometimes nothing but deer tracks. The forest can play tricks on you the way light moves through leaves, the echo of a bird that sounds too much like a voice. Each time we came back empty-handed, I told myself the same thing: the mountains were holding them for now, but they'd give them back. I didn't realize how long for now could last. By November, official efforts had slowed to a crawl. The Ranger Service called it a transition from active to passive search, but it felt like surrender. I kept a stack of flyers in my car and replaced them whenever rain washed the ink away. The photo on the page, Eileen's soft smile, John's arm around Abby, became almost unbearable to look at. People were kind, but over time their kindness took on that quiet edge that says, "We're sorry, but life has to move on." I understood, but I couldn't. Years have a strange way of sliding by when you live with a question that never gets answered. Birthdays came and went. Seasons rolled over each other. Sometimes hikers would call the ranger office after spotting something, a scrap of fabric, a shoe, but every lead ended the same way. Nothing connected. The story of the Bennetts began to drift into legend told in lowered voices around campfires. That family who vanished out by Big Creek. As if they were just a story now, not people with favorite songs and grocery lists. By the 5th year, I stopped expecting the phone to ring. That's the cruelest part of grief, the way your body learns to stop waiting. But even then, I still drove out to the trailhead once in a while, parked in the same gravel lot, and just sat with the windows down listening to the water and the wind pushing through the trees. Sometimes I'd bring flowers and leave them by the signpost. The rangers stopped asking questions when they saw me. They just nodded like we were sharing an understanding no one wanted to say out loud. Then one morning in May, 9 years after that first day, they called me. The ranger's voice was the same tone they use for bad weather warnings, calm but tight. He said there'd been a storm up in the higher ridges strong enough to bring down a lot of old timber. One of their patrols had found something. He didn't tell me what over the phone, just that I should come in. The drive felt longer than it had any right to be. Every curve, every mile marker felt like reopening a wound. When I arrived, they wouldn't let me near the site, just handed me a cup of coffee and asked me to wait. The air inside the ranger station was heavy with silence, the kind that comes before words that will change everything. Hours later, I saw them unloading sealed evidence bags from a truck. I didn't ask what was inside. I already knew. One of the investigators, a man I'd come to know by name over the years, sat across from me at a wooden table. He cleared his throat once before he spoke. "We've found remains," he said softly. 3 sets together. Off the main trail up near Mount Sterling. My heart should have broken right then, but it didn't. It just stopped moving for a moment like it was listening. I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you sure it's them?" He said they would need time to confirm, but everything pointed that way. That night I sat in my car outside the ranger station long after everyone had gone home. The air smelled like rain and earth, thick and cold. Somewhere up there, the mountains had finally exhaled after holding their secret for nearly a decade. But even then, I couldn't quite picture it, how the forest decided after all those years to give them back. The news would spread fast, I knew that. Reporters would come again, cameras, and questions would return. But for me, sitting there in that parking lot with the engine off and the windows fogging it, was just one quiet truth pressing against the glass. The waiting was over. The answers, whatever they were, had finally started to surface. Still, part of me wasn't ready to hear them. Because after 9 years of living inside the unknown, even the truth can sound like thunder. The morning they confirmed it was them, I was sitting in a chair so still I could hear the second hand of the clock behind me. The investigator, one of the younger ones, polite, steady, came into the room holding a manila folder he probably didn't want to open. His voice was quiet when he said my sister's name, almost like he was trying not to disturb her. They'd matched the dental records for Eileen and John, he said, and for the child's remains they'd run a DNA test. They'd used my own sample. It was them. I nodded like I understood, though truth be told, I didn't. It felt impossible that a storm, something as ordinary as wind and rain, had found what hundreds of us couldn't. For 9 years, I'd been praying for answers. Now that I had them, I didn't know what to do with my hands. That night, I drove out to the edge of town where the mountains start to rise. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick and the air had that cold metallic smell that comes after a hard storm. I parked and just sat there staring into the dark. Somewhere beyond those ridges, they'd been waiting all this time under that oak that finally gave out. I kept thinking about that, how something so massive, something that had been rooted for centuries, had to fall before the truth could come up. A few days later, one of the forensic investigators called and asked if I wanted to see the site. I hesitated. He said it might help me understand, so I went. They had the area taped off when I arrived, the kind of yellow tape you see in movies, only here it looked wrong too bright against the muted colors of the forest. The oak lay on its side, a monster of a tree, its roots twisted into the air like a frozen wave. Beneath them was a hollow still muddy from the storm, and in that hollow they'd found what was left of my family. I didn't see the remains, I didn't want to, but I could see the impressions in the soil, the way the earth still bore their shapes. One of the techs told me quietly that it looked like they'd been laid there, not tossed. It wasn't an accident. I remember the way he said that word, laid, like it meant more than he could explain. I went home that evening and couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the outline of those roots, the way they reached upward, pale and tangled like bone. The sheriff's office released a short statement the next morning. The Bennett family missing since September 2014 has been found. Investigation ongoing. I read it over and over. Those last two words felt heavier than the rest. When the autopsy report came back, they called me again. I could tell by the sound of their voices that whatever was in that report wasn't easy to say. I met them at the county building. The conference room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and someone had drawn the blinds halfway down, leaving thin bands of sunlight cutting across the table. The lead investigator, a man named Doyle, took a deep breath before he spoke. "Sarah," he said, "we found injuries. All three of them. The same kind." He paused, waiting for me to nod. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't exposure. Someone hurt them. He slid the folder toward me, but didn't open it. Each one had a wound at the base of the skull, he said quietly. A single blow. Same shape, same size, same angle. He didn't say the word murder, but he didn't have to. It filled the space between us like smoke. I stared at the folder for a long time and thought about how careful John had always been, how he checked their gear twice, how Eileen always carried that extra battery pack for her phone. They'd done everything right. And still, someone had walked up behind them in those woods and ended their lives before the day was even done. The days that followed blurred together. Reporters came back old faces from the first search who'd somehow gotten older like I had. They wanted statements, comments, closure. I gave them none of it. I sat on my porch most evenings with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the light die across the ridge. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence after you finally hear the thing you've dreaded for years. The sheriff's office formed a task force, a mix of local deputies and agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. They combed through every scrap of paper from the original case interviews maps, even the weather reports from that weekend in 2014. Every piece of evidence took on new meaning now that they knew what they were looking at. They weren't searching for hikers who got lost. They were searching for a killer who knew how to make people disappear. One of the agents showed me a list of all the hikers who'd been on the Big Creek Trail that weekend. Most of the names had long since faded into normal life families who'd gone home, students, retirees. But a few entries had question marks beside them. I asked why. The agent said they'd never been able to identify everyone. Some hikers come and go without signing in or out. There was one man, he said, mentioned in a couple of witness statements. Alone. Mid-40s maybe. Kept to himself. I remembered hearing something about that early on, back when they still thought maybe the Bennetts had run into someone. But at the time, nobody had thought much of it. The Smokies are full of loners, photographers, drifters, people who want to be invisible for a few days. Now those vague descriptions were being read like clues. Witnesses recalled a man sitting by the creek near the campsite, staring at the water, not answering when spoken to. Another remembered passing him on the trail. He'd nodded, but never met their eyes. No one had seen his face clearly. It was like trying to remember a shadow. The investigators started calling him the ghost, not officially, but that's what stuck. They followed what leads they could. Checked missing person reports, cross-referenced ranger logs, looked at vehicle records from nearby lots. Nothing matched. It was as if he'd walked out of those woods and vanished just as easily as he'd appeared. The sheriff came by one evening to talk about it. He stood on my porch, hat in his hands, the way men do when they're carrying bad news. "I want you to hear it from me," he said. We're treating this as a homicide. We don't know who yet, but we're going to find out." I thanked him, though I wasn't sure what gratitude even meant anymore. Months passed like that, interviews, reports, quiet frustration. Every new lead turned into a dead end. I started to wonder if the forest itself had swallowed the truth the same way it had swallowed their bodies. One night, unable to sleep, I sat at my kitchen table and spread out an old topographic map of the area. The search routes were still faintly visible, drawn years ago in colored pen. I traced the lines with my finger, following the trail from the parking lot to where they'd found them. The scale of it struck me how close they'd been to safety, maybe less than 2 miles from the main path. It made no sense. Whoever did it knew how to make sure they wouldn't be found. It was around that time that I got a call from Doyle again. His voice carried a new kind of tension, not panic, but the edge of discovery. "We might have something," he said. "We ran the details through VICAP, the national database for violent crimes. There's a hit. Out west." I didn't understand at first what that meant. He explained that another case, another hiker gone missing years after the Bennetts had turned up with the same type of injury. A single blow to the back of the skull. Same precision. Same silence afterward. The words hit me like cold water. For 9 years, I'd thought of my family's story as its own isolated tragedy, something cruel and senseless, but contained. Now I was being told it might not have been isolated at all. There might be others. There might be a pattern. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the faces I'd seen on missing posters in park visitor centers over the years, names I'd barely glanced at, stories I hadn't taken time to read. I thought about how easily people disappear when no one's looking for them. Maybe the person who took my family had done it before. Maybe they'd done it again. The next day, Doyle called back. He said they were flying to Washington State to meet with investigators there, that a young man's body had been found a few years after he vanished, hidden in a remote part of a national forest. The wound was identical. He said they'd found no gear, no equipment, just bones and earth. "We think it's the same man he told me. Same method, same pattern." I didn't say anything for a long while. The thought that someone out there had kept moving, living, breathing after what they'd done, it made the air around me feel heavier. But mixed with the horror was something else: motion. For the first time in nearly a decade, the story was moving again. Before he hung up, Doyle said something I still think about. "If this is the same person, Sarah, he's been out there all this time. We're not the only ones looking for him now." I asked what he meant, but he just said, "You'll understand soon enough." After I put the phone down, I went out to the porch. The wind was moving through the trees, steady and low, the kind of sound that can calm or unsettle you depending on what you're holding inside. I sat there until the stars came out. The porch light buzzed softly above me, and for the first time in years, I didn't turn it off when I went inside. Something told me the darkness ahead wasn't done with us yet. When Doyle called from Washington State, his voice carried that quiet energy I'd come to recognize, the sound of a man holding on to something he knew would change everything. He said they were standing in another forest, this one damp and cold and far from the Smokies, but the scene looked too familiar to ignore. A young man had gone missing there back in 2018. Hiker 20-something, alone. They'd found him tucked under a rock ledge, the way a child might hide something they weren't supposed to have. A single blow to the back of the head. No gear. No trace of who'd done it. Doyle said the wound was nearly identical to the ones found on my sister's family. I remember him pausing, maybe to let that sink in, but all I could think was that somewhere in this country someone had walked up behind another person, another child of someone, and done the same thing. That's when it hit me that the man who killed the Bennetts hadn't vanished at all. He'd just kept walking. The Tennessee and Washington investigators teamed up trading files across 2 time zones. I drove out to Nashville to meet Doyle after he returned. He looked older, thinner, maybe, though that might have just been the exhaustion talking through his eyes. He laid out a stack of photographs on the table, maps, reports, the same forest green in both sets of pictures, whether the trees were Appalachian or Cascadian. It was uncanny. Whoever this is, he said he knows the woods better than most. He knows how to stay unseen. I asked him if it could have been some kind of drifter, maybe a man living off the grid. He nodded slowly. That's our working theory. A transient type, comfortable with isolation, skilled enough to survive without much. He looked up. It's rare someone like that leaves fingerprints, but they always need supplies eventually. That's where we might catch him. A few weeks later, they did. Not the man himself, but a ghost of him caught on an old security camera in a tiny gear shop near Mount Adams, Washington. The footage was grainy black and white, but clear enough to see the outline of a man trading an expensive backpack and tent for a few bills. The clerk remembered him, said he was quiet, polite even, and that he'd sold the items cheap, too cheap, for what they were worth. The clerk hadn't asked questions, just counted out cash and moved on. Doyle told me they ran the serial numbers on the equipment. It matched the gear that had belonged to that missing student. I sat there staring at that still frame of a man with a weathered face and a cap pulled low, and I thought, this is him. This is the man who stood behind my family. Facial recognition gave them a name, Randall Clark. He'd been arrested once in Oregon for vagrancy years earlier. Nothing serious, just a man living between places. 58 years old now, no fixed address, a drifter who moved from one seasonal job to another. No credit cards, no license, no phone records. He'd cut himself clean out of the modern world. I asked Doyle if he was dangerous, and he said, he's been invisible for nearly a decade, and in that time, 5 people are dead. You tell me. From there, the investigation turned into something almost biblical in scope. They sent his photo to every sheriff's office west of the Mississippi, to every Park Service bulletin board, every pawn shop and ranger station. For a long time, nothing came of it. He was a man who knew how to vanish inside open space. Doyle said the hardest part about hunting someone like Clark was that the wilderness worked in his favor. Out there, the line between being lost and being gone is paper thin. I remember that summer dragging on each day heavy with a kind of waiting that felt too familiar. I kept the phone near me at all times. Nights were the worst. I'd sit outside on the porch, listening to the hum of insects and thinking how easy it would be for a man like that to slip through towns unnoticed. I'd picture him crossing state lines, walking down some empty stretch of highway at dusk, shoulders rounded, face lost in the shadow of a brim. Every passing car would see him and forget him in the next mile. Months went by with nothing. And then, one evening in early autumn, Doyle called again. He told me the lead hadn't come from a ranger station or a pawn shop. It had come from a librarian in a small Montana town near the Idaho border. She'd seen a wanted bulletin in her daily emails and recognized the man. Said he'd been coming into the library almost every day for weeks. He never borrowed books, just sat at a corner table reading old newspapers and using the public computer. He kept to himself. The librarian described him as quiet, polite, a little weather-worn. But what struck her most were his eyes. She said they looked tired in a way that felt deliberate, as if he'd been practicing stillness for years. When she saw the alert, she didn't hesitate. She called 911. They arrested him right there between the shelves. No struggle, no words. 2 local deputies and a pair of FBI agents walked in, and when they said his name, he just looked up and held out his hands like he'd been expecting it. Doyle said he didn't blink, didn't even look scared, just resigned. You could tell he knew it was over. Doyle told me later. He'd lived his life waiting for that knock. When they brought Clark in, he didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat there, still as stone, while the investigators laid everything out in front of him. The maps, the photos of the Bennett family, the still frame from that store camera. At first, he didn't speak. Hours passed. Then, slowly, he began to talk. Doyle said his voice was flat, almost academic. He called the wilderness his home. Said hikers were trespassers. people who didn't belong, people who carried things he needed. Sometimes he watched them from a distance. Sometimes he followed them. When asked about the Bennetts, he described it all like he was recounting the weather. He said he'd seen them on the trail by the river, watched them set their packs down, waited until John stepped away toward the water. He moved in from behind, fast and quiet, one strike each. He said it took less than a minute. I couldn't listen when Doyle told me that part. I stepped outside and stood by the railing of the building, my fingers pressed so hard into the wood they left marks. The air felt thin, almost fragile. Behind me, Doyle kept talking, his voice low. Clark had admitted to killing others too, including the young man out west. He said he'd used the same stone each time, one he kept in his pack because it fit his hand perfectly. It's not about hate, he told them. It's about balance. That was the word he used, balance. As if killing families in the woods was some way of keeping the world even. He showed no remorse, no anger, no joy. Just a calm acceptance, as if confessing to the color of the sky. The psychologists later said he likely saw himself as a predator, a part of nature doing what it does. That thought still makes my stomach turn. The trial didn't take long. There wasn't much to argue once they had his confession and the evidence from 2 states. He was sentenced to life without parole. The papers called him the Park Killer, though to me he never felt like anything that deserved a title. He was just a man, a hollow one, with a rock in his hand and emptiness behind his eyes. When it was all over, Doyle came by my house. We sat on the porch as the evening settled in. The cicadas were loud that night, like they were filling the spaces where neither of us could speak. "You got your answers," he said finally. I nodded. "Doesn't feel like much of a win, does it?" he asked. I told him it didn't. The truth rarely feels like victory. It's just a quieter kind of grief. He asked if I planned to attend the sentencing. I said no. I didn't want to see him again, not even from a distance. I'd rather remember the sound of the forest before I knew it could hide something so cruel. Doyle didn't push. Before he left, he said something I'll never forget. He's behind bars now, but the woods will never sound the same. Will they? I shook my head. They wouldn't. That night I drove out one last time to the old trailhead. The lot was empty, the sky clear. I walked to the edge of the trees and stood there until the dark wrapped itself around me. I listened to the creek, to the rustle of leaves, to the world moving like it always had. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine that somewhere in all that quiet, Eileen and John and Abby were still there, not trapped in that awful place anymore, but part of the landscape they'd loved. As I turned back toward the car, I noticed a small stone half buried near the path. Smooth gray, rounded by water. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it for a long moment, thinking about how something so simple could be used to build or to destroy depending on the hand that held it. Then I walked away, leaving it there under the trees where it belonged. Some stories end with justice, others just end. This one, I think, did both. But as I drove home that night, the moon low over the ridge and the forest fading in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder how many other trails and how many other parks had once echoed with the sound of footsteps that never came back. When the verdict came down, I didn't feel triumph or even relief. It was quiet inside that courtroom, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. Randall Clark stood there as the judge read his sentence, life without parole, and he didn't blink. He didn't look at anyone, didn't shift his weight, didn't ask for mercy. For a man who had moved through the world unseen for so long, it was almost fitting that even in that moment he seemed barely there. When they led him out, I kept my eyes on the floor. I'd spent years imagining what justice might look like, and I suppose that was it. A man in cuffs being led away. But it didn't feel like anything. It just felt finished. Afterward, Doyle walked me to the parking lot. The air smelled like rain, heavy and clean, and for the first time since I could remember, I felt tired all the way through. "You did good," he said quietly, though I hadn't done much beyond answer the phone and keep showing up. He said Clark would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, that there'd be no more trails, no more families. "He can't hurt anyone again," he said, and that was supposed to mean something. But as I drove home, I realized the damage he'd done had never really been about the bodies he left behind. It was about the holes he left in the people who had to keep living. The weeks that followed were a kind of fog. Reporters tried to call again, wanting closure pieces, interviews, sound bites. I didn't take any of them. I'd told this story enough. Instead, I spent my evenings the way I used to on the porch, coffee going cold beside me, watching the ridge turn purple at dusk. The cicadas were loud that summer, louder than they'd been in years, or maybe I was just hearing them again. For a while, I couldn't decide if I wanted to move away or plant myself even deeper in this place. The truth was, both ideas hurt for different reasons. The Bennetts were finally laid to rest in the small cemetery behind St. Mark's, the one with the iron gate that always sticks. It was a simple service, just family and a few old neighbors who hadn't stopped checking in over the years. The headstones were modest, one for each of them, side by side, under a maple tree that drops red leaves early in the season. I remember the sound of gravel under the tires as the last car pulled away, and how the air felt almost too still, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I stayed a while after everyone left. You'd think after 9 years of waiting, I'd have something meaningful to say. But I didn't. I just stood there and listened to the wind. In the months that followed, life crept back in the way it always does, uninvited, quiet, insistent. The school year started again, and I went back to work. My students, most of them too young to remember the story, still told me about their weekend hikes, their parents' camping trips. And each time I forced myself to smile and tell them to be careful to pack extra water to stay on the trails. I never told them why I said it like a prayer. Doyle transferred out of state not long after the case closed. He sent me one last letter, said he'd taken a job training younger investigators, teaching them what it means to stay patient when a case runs cold. Sometimes the forest gives back what it takes, he wrote. Sometimes it never does. We still go look. I folded that note and tucked it in the back of my desk drawer. I don't visit the trail often. The park reopened that section a year after the discovery, though most folks still avoid it. When I do go, it's never far, just to the edge where the gravel turns to dirt and the sound of water begins. The big creek still runs clear, just like it did that day in September when Eileen texted me they were by the river. Sometimes I sit there and watch the water curl around the rocks, thinking about how it just keeps going, carrying everything downstream, whether you're ready or not. The Park Service put up a new sign near the trailhead, a safety reminder, the kind they put up after any tragedy. But it doesn't say their names. I asked once if they'd consider adding them. They said they couldn't. Liability policy, something official like that. I didn't argue. I just keep their memory in a place no sign could reach. I've learned something about time, that it doesn't heal the way people say it does. It just changes shape. The grief dulls at the edges, but it never disappears. It just settles into the corners of your days until one small thing stirs it up again. Sometimes it's the smell of wet earth after rain, or the sound of wind in the trees. Sometimes it's nothing at all, just a quiet moment when you realize too much time has passed since you spoke their names out loud. When that happens, I do. I say them softly, like a litany. John, Eileen, Abby. It's not for them, really. It's to remind myself they were real, that their laughter once filled a kitchen, that their car once sat parked in my driveway, that they once thought a weekend hike would be a good way to spend a September morning. The park looks different now. There are more signs, more warnings, more cameras along the access roads. People still come, though fewer linger at the trailhead after dark. Rangers make their rounds a little more often, stop to chat a little longer. You can feel the awareness in the air, that fragile balance between trust and caution. The mountains still draw people in. They always will. But there's a quiet there now, one that wasn't there before. Not the peaceful kind, the remembering kind. As for Clark, last I heard he spends his days in a small, windowless cell. No visitors, no family. Doyle said he doesn't speak much, not even to the guards. Just sits at his table and writes things down in a small notebook. No one knows what. Part of me wonders if he writes about the woods, about the rivers, about the trails he once walked like they belonged to him. The rest of me doesn't care. His world has finally shrunk to the size of a room, and that's as close to justice as I'll ever get. Every year, around the anniversary of their disappearance, I drive up to Mount Sterling. I bring fresh flowers, the kind Eileen liked, white lilies always too delicate for the wind. I park near the ranger station hike in just far enough to see the slope where the oak fell. The tree's still there, or what's left of it. The roots are gray now, hollowed by time. The forest has begun to take it back, moss climbing up the trunk, wildflowers sprouting in the hollow. Nature always finds a way to cover what it's not ready to show. I stand there for a while, then leave the flowers near the roots. Not as an offering, but as a reminder. They were found here. They existed here. Sometimes when the sun dips low and the light hits the water just right, I think I can almost see them. John teaching Abby how to skip stones, Eileen standing off to the side laughing at their failed attempts. It's not real, I know that. But memory has a way of stitching moments together so cleanly you can almost step inside them. And for a heartbeat or two, the years fall away. People ask me sometimes how I live with it, how you move forward after something like that. I don't have a good answer. You don't move past it. You just learn to walk alongside it. The pain becomes part of the landscape, like a scar in the earth that fills with rain but never quite closes. I've stopped trying to forget. Remembering hurts less than pretending it didn't happen. Now, when I see hikers loading up their cars at dawn, I don't warn them anymore. I just watch. They look like my sister once did, hopeful, eager, unaware of how fast a beautiful day can turn. I watch them disappear down the trail, their laughter fading into the trees, and I whisper a small wish into the wind. Come back safe. Because that's all any of us really want in the end, to leave and come home again. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.